Why didn't he keep climbing when the engine failed? That's one of the most haunting questions surrounding the Greg Biffle citation crash. When you lose an engine on a twin-engine aircraft, especially a jet with good single-engine performance like the Citation II, conventional wisdom says you should continue the climb, gain altitude, get some breathing room, then turn around and come back when you have the altitude to work with. Altitude is safety. Altitude is time. Altitude is options. So why did the crew level off at approximately 2,000 feet, begin descending, and immediately maneuver back toward the airport instead of continuing to climb to a safer altitude first? That decision, to stop climbing and turn back immediately from low altitude, may have been the critical choice that determined the outcome of this accident. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're examining one of the most fundamental decisions in aviation emergency management, whether to continue away from the airport to gain altitude or to turn back immediately, and why the choice made on the Biffle flight may have cost 3 lives. Let's start by understanding what we know happened based on the limited available data. The Cessna Citation departed runway 10 at Statesville Regional Airport at approximately 10:05 local time on a January morning. Weather conditions were marginal visual meteorological conditions. Cloud ceilings were reported at 1,200 feet broken. Visibility was 5 statute miles in light drizzle. These are legal VFR conditions, barely, but they're not comfortable conditions. You're operating right at the edge between VFR and instrument conditions. The Citation lifted off and began what appeared to be a normal initial climb. ADS-B tracking data, though limited, shows the aircraft climbed to approximately 2,000 feet. That's consistent with VFR flight staying below the 1,200-foot broken ceiling, probably climbing to stay clear of clouds while remaining in visual conditions. For perhaps 2 to 3 minutes, everything appeared routine. The aircraft was climbing, accelerating, proceeding on the departure path. Then, something catastrophic occurred. Based on post-crash evidence, specifically the missing right-hand baggage door and the severe foreign object damage to the right-hand engine, it appears the baggage door opened in flight, and items from the baggage compartment were ingested into the number 2 engine. The engine destroyed itself within seconds. Fan blades shattered. Compressor stages failed. The engine went from producing maximum thrust to producing zero thrust and significant drag almost instantaneously. At this point, the crew faced the decision we're examining today. They were at approximately 2,000 feet. They had one good engine and one failed engine. The aircraft was fully capable of flying on one engine. Citation. 2 single-engine performance, especially at light weights and low altitude, is actually quite good. The aircraft can maintain altitude and even climb slowly on one engine under most conditions, so the crew had options. They could have continued climbing on the one good engine, gaining altitude, getting up to 5,000 or 8,000 or even 10,000 feet, where they would have had time and options to deal with the emergency properly. Or they could turn back immediately, accepting the low altitude, and try to get back to the runway as quickly as possible. The tracking data shows they chose the second option. The aircraft leveled off at approximately 2,000 feet. Airspeed began to decrease, suggesting the crew reduced power. The aircraft began a descent and began maneuvering back toward the airport, apparently setting up to land on runway 28, the opposite direction from their departure. This was a decision to get back on the ground immediately rather than to climb away and gain altitude first. Approximately 10 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft impacted terrain approximately 1,800 feet short of runway 28. All 3 occupants were killed. The aircraft was destroyed. They were close to the runway, very close, but they didn't make it. And the critical question is whether they would have made it if they had made a different choice at that decision point. If they had continued climbing instead of immediately turning back, would the outcome have been different? To answer this question, we need to understand the trade-offs involved in this decision, the advantages and disadvantages of each option, and what factors should drive the decision. Let's start with the option they didn't choose, continuing to climb away from the airport. What would that have looked like and what would it have accomplished? When you lose an engine on a twin-engine aircraft, your first priority is to maintain aircraft control and maintain airspeed above minimum control speed. Minimum control speed, VMC, is the slowest speed at which you can maintain directional control, with one engine at maximum thrust and one engine failed. For the Citation II, VMC is approximately 90 to 95 knots depending on configuration. Below this speed, you cannot counteract the asymmetric thrust with rudder. The aircraft will yaw uncontrollably toward the dead engine. Your second priority is to maintain or gain altitude if possible. Altitude gives you time. time to diagnose the problem, time to run checklists, time to make decisions, time to set up approaches, time to deal with secondary failures if they occur. If you're at 10,000 feet when an engine fails, you have perhaps 15 to 20 minutes before you must be on a runway. That's a lot of time to work the problem. If you're at 1,000 feet, you have maybe 2 minutes. That's barely enough time to turn around. So the standard emergency procedure for an engine failure after takeoff in a multi-engine aircraft, the procedure that's taught and practiced extensively, is to first maintain directional control and maintain airspeed, then to identify the failed engine, then to begin securing the failed engine, while the other pilot or you, if you're alone, continue flying the aircraft and ideally continue climbing. The idea is to get to a safe altitude before you do anything else. Get high enough that you have time and options. Then, from that position of safety, you can make informed decisions about where to land and how to configure the approach. If the Biffle crew had chosen this option, if they had continued climbing on the good engine instead of leveling off and turning back, what would have happened? At 2,000 feet when the engine failed, they could have continued straight ahead, maintaining climb power on the good engine. Citation: two single-engine climb performance at low altitude and lightweight is approximately 300 to 500 feet per minute. Not spectacular, but adequate. In 2 minutes, they could have climbed another 1,000 feet to 3,000 feet. In 5 minutes, they could have been at 4,000 feet or higher. At 4,000 feet, they would have had significantly more time and options. They could have run the complete engine shutdown checklist methodically. They could have assessed the situation, determined whether there was additional damage beyond the engine. They could have contacted air traffic control, declared an emergency, gotten vectors and altitude assignments. They could have briefed the approach, discussed options, decided whether to return to Statesville or divert to a larger airport with longer runways and better emergency equipment like Charlotte. Most importantly, they could have set up a proper instrument approach with altitude protection, glide path guidance, and plenty of margin for error. Even in marginal VFR, even with low ceilings, an approach from 4,000 feet gives you multiple chances to get it right. If the first approach doesn't look good, you can go around and try again. You have fuel for multiple approaches. You have altitude to work with. But that's not what they chose. They chose to level off, stop climbing, and turn back immediately from 2,000 feet. Why? What would drive that decision? To understand this, we need to think about what was happening in that cockpit in those moments. The engine had just failed catastrophically. If the baggage door was open, there was probably tremendous noise, wind, possibly items flying around the cabin. The crew was dealing with a sudden, violent, unexpected emergency. Stress levels were extremely high. Adrenaline was flooding their systems. Heart rates were elevated. Cognitive function was being degraded by the stress response. In that moment, the instinct, the overwhelming gut reaction, is to get back on the ground as fast as possible. The airport is right there behind you. You just left from there. There's a safe runway. The approaches. It's familiar. The psychological pull to turn around and get back to that runway immediately is incredibly strong. Continuing to climb away from the airport, flying away from safety, feels wrong even though rationally it's probably the better choice. Your instinct screams at you to turn around now, get back now, land now. There's another factor that may have influenced the decision. If the baggage door was open and visible to the crew, if they could see it flapping or see items departing, they may have been uncertain about the extent of the damage. Was it just the engine, or was there structural damage to the wing or fuselage? Were control surfaces damaged? Was there fire risk? When you're uncertain about how bad things are, when you don't know if the aircraft is going to hold together, the instinct is to get it on the ground immediately before things get worse. There's also the training factor. How the crew had been trained and what scenarios they had practiced would have influenced their decision-making. If they had extensively practiced engine failures at altitude in the simulator, they might have been comfortable continuing to climb. But if their training focused on immediate returns, on getting back to the runway quickly, that's what they would default to under stress. Under extreme stress, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall back to your training. Whatever you've practiced most is what you'll do when the adrenaline is pumping and conscious thought is difficult. There's one more factor we need to consider, and it's the one we don't know yet, but which may be the most important. Who was flying the aircraft and what was their experience level? We know Dennis Dutton, the only person on board with a citation type rating, was a highly experienced professional pilot, a retired airline captain with decades of experience. But We don't know who was in the right seat or what their capability level was. If Dennis was essentially flying alone because his co-pilot was inexperienced and unable to help effectively, that would have massively influenced the decision. Flying a single-engine approach from altitude requires crew coordination. One pilot flies while the other manages systems, runs checklists, handles communications, monitors the approach. If you're doing all of that yourself, if you're task saturated trying to manage everything alone, the complexity of a high altitude approach may seem overwhelming. The simpler option, the option that requires less systems management and less complexity, is to just turn around and land visually as quickly as possible. So we can understand why the crew made the choice they made. In the moment, under stress, with uncertainty about the extent of damage, possibly without effective crew coordination, the decision to turn back immediately made sense. It felt like the right choice. It felt like the safest choice. Get the aircraft back on the ground at the familiar airport as quickly as possible before anything else goes wrong. But here's the brutal question. Was it actually the right choice, or did it feel right while actually being the more dangerous option? Let's examine what happened as a result of that choice. By leveling off at 2,000 feet and turning back immediately, the crew accepted several constraints and risks. First, they accepted limited altitude. 2,000 feet is not much. That's maybe 2 to 3 minutes of flight time if you're descending at a normal rate. If anything goes wrong, if you misjudge the approach, if you need to go around, you don't have altitude to work with. Second, they accepted a complex maneuvering situation at low altitude. To get from the departure path to an approach for the opposite runway requires a 180-degree turn. Turning at low altitude with asymmetric thrust, in marginal weather, while managing an emergency, is a high-risk maneuver. Bank angle increases stall speed. The turn takes time and bleeds energy. If you mismanage airspeed or bank angle, you can stall, and at low altitude there's no time to recover. Third, they accepted poor visual reference for altitude and distance judgment. At 2,000 feet in marginal VFR with low ceilings and drizzle, visual references are degraded. You can't clearly see the horizon. You can't accurately judge your height above terrain or your distance from the runway. It's very easy to misjudge and end up too low on approach. And that appears to be exactly what happened. The final ADS-B data point shows the aircraft low and apparently lined up with runway 28. Then, 30 seconds later, impact 1,800 feet short of the runway. They misjudged. They were lower than they thought, or farther out than they thought, or descending faster than they thought. With better visual reference, with more altitude, with more time, they probably would have recognized the error and corrected. But at low altitude in marginal weather with limited time, they didn't catch it until it was too late. Now let's consider the counterfactual. What if they had continued climbing instead? What would have been different? First, they would have had significantly more altitude by the time they turned back toward the airport. Even just continuing to climb for 2 more minutes would have given them another 1,000 feet. 5 more minutes would have given them another 2,000 feet. At 4,000 feet instead of 2,000 feet, they would have had double the time to work the problem. Second, they could have set up a proper stabilized approach instead of a rushed visual approach. With more altitude, they could have maneuvered to intercept an instrument approach, or at least a proper visual pattern. They could have configured the aircraft on a stabilized glide path with plenty of time to adjust if needed. They wouldn't have been rushed, wouldn't have been scrambling to make the runway. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they would have had margin for error. If the first approach didn't look good, if they were too high or too low or too fast, they could have gone around and tried again. At 4,000 feet with one engine operating, they would have had fuel for multiple approach attempts. They could have taken their time, gotten it right, landed safely. But from 2,000 feet with minimal fuel burn time, they probably felt they had one shot. They had to make this approach work because they might not get another chance. The evidence strongly suggests that if they had continued climbing to a higher altitude before turning back, they would have survived. The engine failure itself was completely survivable. The aircraft was fully capable of flying on one engine. The pilot was fully qualified and experienced. But the decision to turn back from low altitude instead of climbing first put them in a situation with no margin for error. And when you have no margin for error, any small misjudgment becomes fatal. This brings us to a fundamental principle of aviation emergency management, one that's been proven over and over in accident investigations. Altitude is life. Time is safety. Rushing to get back on the ground when you have a flyable aircraft is usually the wrong choice. The better choice almost always is to take your time, gain altitude, assess the situation properly, and then make informed decisions from a position of safety rather than a position of desperation. There are exceptions to this principle. If you have an engine fire that's spreading, if you have structural damage that's getting worse, if you're losing controllability, then yes, getting on the ground immediately is the right choice. You can't afford to wait. But if you have a failed engine and the aircraft is otherwise flyable, if systems are working and you have control, taking the time to climb to a safe altitude is almost always the better choice, even though your instinct tells you otherwise. The airline industry learned this lesson decades ago. Airline procedures for engine failures after takeoff emphasize continuing the climb to a safe altitude before doing anything else. The immediate action items are maintain control, maintain airspeed, maintain directional control, then continue the climb. Only after reaching a safe altitude, usually several thousand feet minimum, do you start running the full engine shutdown checklist. Only after you have altitude and time do you make decisions about where to land. This procedure has been proven over and over to maximize survival. There are countless cases of airline flights that lost an engine after takeoff, continued climbing to a safe altitude, worked the problem methodically, and returned to land without incident. The passengers often didn't even know there was an emergency until after landing. That's how it should work when you have altitude and time to manage the situation properly. But Part 91 operations, private flying, often doesn't have the same level of procedural discipline. Decisions are more individualized, more dependent on the pilot's judgment and experience rather than on standardized procedures. And under stress, without the structure of rigorous procedures, pilots often make instinctive rather than optimal decisions. The instinct to get back on the ground immediately is powerful, and without strong training that emphasizes the importance of altitude first, that instinct often wins. There's another aspect of this decision that we need to examine, and it relates to the specific characteristics of the citation and what makes jets different from piston-engine aircraft. In a light piston twin, single-engine climb performance is often marginal or even negative. If you lose an engine in a heavily loaded piston twin, you might not be able to climb at all. You might actually be descending even at full power on the good engine. In that situation, continuing straight ahead trying to climb might not be an option. You're going down whether you want to or not, so you might as well turn back and try to make the airport. But jets are different. Jets, especially turbofan-powered jets like the Citation, have much better power-to-weight ratios. Even on one engine, a Citation at typical weights and altitudes can usually climb at 300 to 500 feet per minute or more. That's real climb performance. That's enough to gain meaningful altitude in a reasonable time. So the option to continue climbing is actually viable in a way it might not be in a piston twin. This better performance should make the decision easier. You know you can climb on one engine, you know you can gain altitude. So the logical choice is to do exactly that, to take advantage of the capability you have and use it to gain the safety buffer of altitude. But the psychological factors, the stress, the uncertainty, the instinct to get back immediately, those don't change based on aircraft performance. The instinct to turn back is just as strong in a jet as in a piston twin, even though the jet is more capable of executing the safer alternative of climbing away first. Let's talk about another factor that may have influenced the decision, something we haven't discussed yet but which could be critical. If the baggage door opening and the engine failure happened at lower altitude than 2,000 feet, if it happened at, say, 1,000 feet or 1,200 feet, the crew may have initially tried to continue climbing but found the performance insufficient or the situation too chaotic. They may have climbed to 2,000 feet, realized they were struggling, and made the decision at that point to level off and turn back rather than trying to continue higher. If that's what happened, it would explain the flight profile we see. Initial climb to 2,000 feet, level off, airspeed reduction, turn back toward the airport. It would also change the analysis somewhat, because it would mean they did try to climb initially, but made a judgment call that continuing higher wasn't working. We won't know for certain until the NTSB releases the full data, but it's a possibility worth considering. Even if that's what happened, though, the question remains whether they should have persisted in the climb despite the difficulties. Single-engine climbs are not comfortable. The aircraft is in an unusual configuration. A symmetric thrust creates constant yaw that must be held with rudder pressure. Climb rates are low. It feels like you're barely climbing, like you're just hanging there. The natural reaction is that this isn't working, that you need to do something different. But if you persist, if you maintain the proper airspeed and configuration, the aircraft will climb, it will gain altitude, It will get you to a position of safety. This is why training is so critical. You need to have practiced single-engine operations enough that you know what normal single-engine performance feels like. You need to know that, yes, it feels slow and uncomfortable, but yes, it is working and you are climbing. Without that experience, without that confidence in what the aircraft can do, it's easy to give up too soon, to decide it's not working, and you need to turn back now. There's one more scenario we should consider, and it's one of the most insidious failure modes in multi-engine operations. What if they shut down the wrong engine? This happens more often than most people realize. In the stress and confusion of an emergency, especially if there's damage or chaos or distractions, pilots have been known to identify the wrong engine as failed and shut down the good engine, leaving them with no engines producing thrust. Modern aircraft have procedures to prevent this. You're supposed to verify which engine has failed by checking multiple instruments before you start shutting things down. You're supposed to use the memory aid dead foot dead engine, meaning the engine that's failed is on the same side as the rudder pedal. You're not pushing because you need to push the rudder on the opposite side to counteract asymmetric thrust. But under stress, mistakes happen. If the Biffle crew shut down the left engine instead of the right engine, if they secured the good engine and left the failed engine windmilling, they would have had no thrust at all. The aircraft would have become a glider. From 2,000 feet, they would have had maybe 2 to 3 minutes of glide time before impact. They could have turned back toward the airport, gotten lined up, but been unable to maintain altitude or arrest descent rate. They would have come up short of the runway, exactly as happened. This is speculation. We have no evidence this occurred. But it's a scenario that fits the facts and that has occurred in previous accidents with eerily similar profiles. The NTSB will be able to determine from the wreckage examination and from the cockpit voice recorder whether both engines were secured or only one, and whether the correct engine was shut down. If they shut down the wrong engine, that would completely change the analysis and would explain why they didn't keep climbing. They couldn't keep climbing because they had no engines producing thrust. Assuming they didn't shut down the wrong engine, assuming the left engine was running and producing thrust, we come back to the fundamental question. Why didn't they keep climbing? The evidence suggests the most likely answer is a combination of factors. Psychological pressure to get back on the ground immediately. Possibly uncertainty about the extent of damage making them reluctant to stay airborne longer than necessary. Possible task saturation if the pilot was flying alone without effective crew, helped making a complex high-altitude approach seem overwhelming. Possible lack of training, emphasis on altitude first, making the immediate turn back seem like standard procedure. All of these factors together created a decision-making environment where continuing to climb felt wrong and turning back immediately felt right, even though rationally the opposite was true. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of aviation emergencies. Your instincts, your gut reactions, the things that feel right in the moment, are often exactly the wrong things to do. And unless you've trained extensively to override those instincts, unless you've practiced until the correct response is automatic, you'll default to the instinctive response when the real emergency hits. The lesson from this accident, the lesson that applies to every pilot who might face a similar situation, is this. When you lose an engine after takeoff and the aircraft is still flying, when you have control and you have power, your first priority should almost always be to gain altitude before you do anything else. Altitude is safety. Altitude is time. Altitude is options. Don't give up that altitude by leveling off and turning back immediately unless you have no other choice. Climb. Get to 3,000 feet minimum, 5,000 feet if you can. Then, from that position of safety, with time to think and time to plan, make your decisions about where to land and how to configure the approach. Yes, it feels wrong to fly away from the airport. Yes, your instinct tells you to turn around now. But your instinct is wrong. Trust your training. Trust the procedures. Trust the proven fact that altitude saves lives. If you're going to attempt an immediate turn back from low altitude, you need to have practiced that specific maneuver extensively. You need to know exactly what performance your aircraft is capable of. You need to have done it in the simulator or with an instructor at altitude. You need to know precisely how much altitude you'll lose, what bank angle to use, what airspeed to maintain. And even then, you need to recognize that real emergencies don't happen in perfect conditions and that any error in execution will probably be fatal. The safer choice, the choice that gives you the best probability of survival, is almost always to keep climbing first. Get altitude, get time, get options. Then make informed decisions from a position of strength rather than desperate decisions from a position of weakness. That's the lesson Dennis Dutton and Greg Biffle and Jack Dutton paid for with their lives. That's the lesson we need to learn so their deaths weren't in vain. Altitude is life. Don't give it up. Keep climbing when your engine fails. Get high enough that you have time and options. Then, and only then, start making your way back to a runway. That's how you survive. Thanks for watching.